announce its troop pullout from Afghanistan, the Taliban continue to make gains across the country amid growing questions about the stability of the Afghan government. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. The US says it will continue to conduct airstrikes against the Taliban following their rapid territorial gains in recent weeks. While the Taliban claim to control 85% of Afghanistan, US officials say that over 200 of 419 Afghan district centers are now under Taliban control. The US's top military commander, General Mark Milley, said recently that, quote, strategic momentum appears to be with the Taliban. Now, amid the rapidly changing situation on the ground, the commander of the US Central Command, General Frank McKenzie, assured Afghan President Ashraf Ghani that the US would continue to provide air support to Afghan forces as the US completes its pullout by August 31st. Meanwhile, the latest round of intra-Afghan talks held earlier this month in Qatar between representatives from the Afghan government and the Taliban ended with little progress as both sides committed to, quote, continue negotiations at a high level until a settlement is reached. In a few moments, we'll be speaking with Zalmay Khalilzad, the US Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation, about the prospects of an agreement between the two sides. But first, we travel to Kabul to meet two young Afghans who share their views and concerns about the future.
اگر طالبا بیایه من نمیتونم، خب یک چیز واضح است، من نمیتونم در روی سرک با گیتارم را برم و نواختن گیتار خود یک گپ دیگه است. من فکر میکنم ما مجبور میشیم باز آلات موسیقی خود دفن کنیم. من خیلی نگران هستم، بله خیلی نگران هستم از خاطر که ای 20 ساله را که من زندگی کردم در افغانستان. 20 ساله بود که من همیشه امیدوار بودم با آینده افغانستان و همیشه ماندم اینجا که افغانستان جور شود، ولی این حالت نگران کننده است و خیلی هم ترسناک است، خصوصا برای اقلیت‌های مثل من که نقاشی میکنم، که هنر کار میکنم. برای من خیلی خطرناک است. من باید یا نقاشی نکنم و مثل طالبا که فکر میکنن مثل ازوا زندگی کنم، باید برم ریش بانم، باید سرجان من نشویم، باید مثلا نقاشی کار نکنم، موسیقی گوش نکنم، موسیقی کار نکنم و بایدم مثل ازوا باشم و اگر مثل طالبا نباشم نمیتونم زندگی کنم اینجا. بنان امو آزادی که بیانم است ازم گرفته میشه، آزادی، freedom of speech، freedom of expression، تمام ارزش‌هایی را که ما در این 20 سال با حضور خارجی ها در اینجا تجربه کردیم و تمرین کردیم، او تجربه را، او ارزش‌ها را ما نمی داشته باشیم.
بایسکل سواری یکی از ورزش‌هایی بود که من خیلی علاقه داشتم ولی خیلی خوش داشتم. مثلا بعضی ویدیوهایی که می‌دیدم که بچه‌ها در سر بایسکل حرکات‌های خوبش انجام میده، باز من همونا رو دیده شوق می‌گرفتم که من خواستم یکی از افراد باشم که بتونم همراه بایسکل راحت باشم، بتونم حرکات مختلف انجام بدم همراهش. خب من نمیخوایم مثلا دوباره در امو روزای گذشته که خیلی سخت داشتیم در سابق و فعلا حالی که میبینیم اصل اطلاعات و ارتباطات هست دیگه، نمیخوایم که دوباره در او دنیای تاریک در او. خب من مثلا نمیخوایم که طالبا که میایه اونا مانع پیشرفت ما شوه و ما هم در هر حالتی که باشه میخوایم به هدفی که دارم برسم. حتی اگر مثلا در بیرونم برآمده نتونم، در خانه که هستم میخوایم تمرینات خود ادامه بدم و هیچ وقت نمانم که طالبا مرا از رسیدن به هدفم مانع شود.
کابل نمیشود کابل بدون تو تحمل نمیشود.
So, with the US set to complete its withdrawal from Afghanistan by the end of August, what are the prospects for real peace among Afghans? I'm now joined by Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, the US Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation. Ambassador Khalilzad, we just heard from young Afghans who are fearful about the future. If, or rather when, the Taliban retake power, there are reports as well, as you know, that they have already imposed harsh restrictions in the districts they now control. You're an Afghan by birth. You grew up in Kabul. How do you relate to these fears?
Well, I relate to them in two ways. One, I know that all Afghans, including young people, are yearning for peace. They have not known a period of peace for many of them, since Afghanistan is a relatively young population. But at the same time, of course, given the record of the Taliban when they were last in power, and the achievements of the last 20 years since the US went into Afghanistan, the progress that has been made, there are concerns, and legitimate concerns with regard to what could happen, whether as we push and support and stand with them, that the future needs to be built on the achievements of the past. And I tell the Taliban that they don't know the new Afghanistan, what Kabul is like, and that they need to move forward based on the successes that have been achieved. But I understand their concern.
But can you build on the successes that have been achieved? Because there is a sense of betrayal among many Afghans that the US is essentially handing over the keys over to the Taliban. You must be conflicted as the US chief negotiator.
Well, as I said to you, all Afghans want to have this war end. The last 20 years has been marred. On the one hand, there has been good progress, but also by continuing war, killing and suffering. So bringing that to an end, we had to negotiate an agreement with the Taliban. But now comes the phase of Afghans negotiating with each other about the future. And I believe a good agreement between the two sides would have to respect the achievements of the past, respect the fundamental rights of all Afghans, including Afghan women. For if they don't, we have made it clear to the Taliban that what they want from us, from the international community, recognition, assistance, support, and end to being on the blacklist, all of that would be at risk if there isn't a negotiated agreement that respects the fundamental rights of all Afghans.
But just looking at just how much has been achieved, I mean, there's no doubt there's been progress, one would argue, since the US invasion, but arguably very little considering that the US and NATO and the UN have been at work in Afghanistan for 20 years, the longest US war, trillions of dollars later. There's still endemic corruption. There are weak institutions, an overstretched Afghan military, insecurity, a lot of uncertainty. In fact, 90% of Afghans survive on less than $2 a day. Your own State Department, in its annual reports, has shown how much widespread abuses there are in government-held areas. So it's still a rather dismal picture, isn't it?
Well, I would respectfully disagree. I believe that there has been a lot of achievements. Afghans are living on average 10 years or more, some say up to 20 years longer than they did before the US came to Afghanistan. Education, women's education, in terms of the infrastructure of the country. Kabul, when I went there after 30 plus years in 2002, was a dead city. Now it's a city full of life with 5-6 million people living in it, with traffic jam. There was no cell phones when I went to Kabul in 2002. too widespread. I had to give satellite phones to government officials to be able to communicate with each other. Now there are 4 cell phones. Afghanistan is connected. But you're right about
Sure, Ambassador. But I mean, has the development of Afghanistan matched the investment? Because even looking at it through the very narrow prism of the 9/11 justification of the invasion of Afghanistan, can you deny that the US in fact failed to achieve its central aim, which was defeating al-Qaeda? It was forced after 20 years to negotiate with the Taliban. A congressional paper, in fact, just this past June, states, quote, Taliban links with al-Qaeda remain in place, according to UN sanctions monitors.
Well, again, although I agree that some of the institutional weaknesses that you referred to are there, although some of these institutions did not exist in 2001, 2002. There was no national army. Now there is a national army. Limitations, yes, it has, but it exists. Now, on our central objective that you mentioned, we are satisfied that we made tremendous progress in dealing with the issue of al-Qaeda that orchestrated the dastardly attack of 9/11, that Osama bin Laden has been killed. Many other leaders of al-Qaeda have been killed. Many left Afghanistan. Many are arrested. The al-Qaeda challenge has transformed. Afghanistan is not as central as it was. It's diffused. We need to adjust to that threat. And besides, the Taliban in our agreement, and this is what we wanted, agreed not to allow al-Qaeda specifically, but any terrorist group that would threaten the United States or our allies to use Afghanistan. So on the terrorism front, we're satisfied that we have achieved our objective. We worry about terrorism. We're adjusting our posture to be able to deal with it. But as far as Afghanistan is concerned, we have also opened the door for the first time in 43 years for Afghan parties to sit across the table to negotiate with each other. That also is positive and a historic development.
But are you satisfied, though, about where you leave the Taliban? Because many would argue that today's Taliban are in a much stronger position than they were almost 20 years ago, after the US ousted them from power. Now, you're the chief architect of the US-Taliban agreement.
Right.
Was it a mistake not to bring in the Afghan government to begin with? Did this undermine their position? And clearly the US violated the accords. Certainly the Taliban believe they did by not withdrawing last May, as had been agreed. And that gave the Taliban an opening. It gave them the pretext to take more territory. So my question is this: with all the intelligence, all the means the US has, you must have known that the Taliban had the capacity to overrun the government in Kabul after the US-NATO pullout. So why give them that opening? Was the US simply going to leave no matter what because it was politically and militarily a war that it could not win? I mean, you know Afghans, they are resilient.
First, I again disagree that the Taliban are stronger than they were 20 years ago. They were the government of Afghanistan 20 years ago.
But they control, Ambassador, more than 54% of the districts. A Congressional Research Service report says the Taliban.
Well, they control 95% of Afghanistan when we went to Afghanistan. There was a small part of Afghanistan in Panjshir Valley and in the north that the opposition controlled. They held Kabul. So, but of course,
they now control this amount of territory after 20 years of the U.S. being there. A congressional report paper says the Taliban is in a much stronger position now than at any point since 2001, controlling as much as half the country. And you've heard the statements made by General Milley and the former commander in Afghanistan, who both said that we could see an all-out complete military takeover by the Taliban, including a potential civil war. How concerned are you?
Well, we're obviously concerned about the situation, but we believe that there is no military solution to the war in Afghanistan. If the Taliban push for a military victory, there will be resistance to them. Afghanistan will face the prospects of a long war. The Talibs will not receive assistance, will not receive recognition. if they take over, their government will be a pariah government. We believe that the solution that the Afghans yearn for that would work is a political agreement between the Taliban and the other Afghans over a formula for the future of the country, and that the agreement between the United States and the Taliban has opened the door for that sort of an agreement, and therefore I believe it has been a positive development that that agreement was signed. Now the time has come, with the help of the region, with the help of the United Nations, which has become more active in the peace process, with the help of some countries like Qatar for the negotiations to make more progress. There is no military solution. It's either a long war or a political settlement.
You say there's no military solution, but should the United States have negotiated, in hindsight, with the Taliban many years ago? Given the fact that, as you know, Afghans have been at war for the past 5 decades, they're the only country, if not the only people, to have defeated 2 superpowers, the Soviet Union and now the United States. It seems like history repeats itself. Should the U.S. have known better and negotiated with the Taliban far earlier than now?
Well, it would have been good if the Taliban had been willing to negotiate and join the bond process when, after 9/11, the political agreement that produced a roadmap for Afghanistan for the last 20 years. And now it would have been good for the Taliban and the government to reach an agreement in the years in between. But the Talibs did not want to negotiate with the government before reaching an agreement with the United States. And that was one of the reasons for why we reached an agreement with the Taliban to open the door for the government of Afghanistan, this new Afghanistan, and the Taliban to negotiate with each other. There simply was not a better alternative, given the circumstances that we face, than first an agreement between us and the Taliban, and second, for Afghans to negotiate with each other.
And now, as you know, the Afghan government, although they've been trying to downplay the significance of the U.S. military pullout, there's real anxiety. President Ghani said not too long ago, quote, "We will not be able to support our army for 6 months without U.S. support." I know the U.S. since 2014 has provided 75% of the $5 to $6 billion that the Afghan security forces get. President George W. Bush, under whose watch this invasion was launched back in 2001, in fact, criticized the pullout. A few days ago in an interview, he said it was a mistake to leave Afghanistan now. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, says he doesn't think the end game is yet written. There's a lot of trepidation.
Yeah.
How concerned are you about these
trepidation
these
is
fears?
justified, concern is justified, but staying on with the policy, with the approach we had 20 years and longer was also not tenable. We are going to support the Afghan government. While we support the negotiated settlement, we are going to support the Afghan government. We are going to support the Afghan military. We're going to provide financial support for the military. We're going to provide economic support. We're going to provide humanitarian support. We will engage diplomatically, use the diplomatic powers of the United States to facilitate, to encourage international support.
But Ambassador, realistically, though,
for a good outcome for these negotiations.
Realistically, though, Congress would have to approve this continued investment. And let's face it, after you do pull out of Afghanistan on the 31st of August, although you will retain, it sounds like, the ability to strike at Taliban targets even after you leave, there are questions about to what extent the U.S. has the will to continue helping Afghanistan and the kind of leverage the United States will retain, because the Afghan government as well, let's not forget, is facing a resurgent, emboldened Taliban. A delegation just came back from China, having secured the support of the Chinese. So they do have a stronger position today, not just militarily, but politically as well than they did before. And they number about 60,000 fighters.
Right. But the government has 300,000 fighters. They have an air force. They have modern equipment. They have intelligence organizations, they have strong relationships with powers such as the United States and the international community. So yes, the Taliban are stronger than they were at times in the past, and that it's not surprising that with the withdrawal of U.S. forces, there would be some shift in the balance of power on the ground. But the government is by the facts that I just described, are in a stronger position. And the question is, will the government use the capabilities that it has effectively? We are supportive of the government. There is bipartisan agreement in terms of continuing support for the government and for negotiations that meet some basic standards. The standards are, one, that the future government has to be inclusive, meaning the various Afghan communities must see themselves in the picture. Two, that the future government must respect the fundamental rights of all Afghans. Three, that the Afghan people must have a say in what kind of government or who governs them. Four, that the Afghanistan is never again becomes a platform for terror against the international community, especially the United States and our allies. And five, that Afghanistan respects, adheres to, delivers on its commitments under international law. Those are the five principles that should characterize a peace agreement, for without which the international community, particularly the United States, will not be able to support the government in Afghanistan that comes through military imposition and that not adhere to these five principles.
But these principles, Ambassador Khalilzad, with respect, all sound wonderful. But realistically speaking, in a practical sense, although we heard the Taliban make statements that I'm sure the United States and others have welcomed, that they would adhere to this vision of Afghanistan, they still have left out a lot of details about the kind of structure of the future government and the kind of governance they have in mind. There have been reports in the Afghan media that the United States is putting together some kind of a concrete power-sharing alternative to push the two parties forward, to jumpstart the talks in Doha that seem to be stalled, something that would lead to a transitional peace government and, quote, the selection of a new president acceptable to both sides. The Taliban have said repeatedly that they will not negotiate until Ashraf Ghani, or will not reach a final agreement until the president leaves office. Is he part of the problem? Can you confirm these reports?
Well, we do believe that there has to be negotiations on details that you refer to. That's what the peace negotiations are about, the details of the agreement. The principles you've said, we've heard encouraging things, and we've noted those commitments by the Talibs that they would adhere to certain principles. Now the details needs to be worked out in negotiations between the government and the Taliban. And there have been some important and serious exchanges in the last few weeks. But a lot more work needs to be done. Progress has to be made at a much faster pace. That's why we're asking Qatar to accelerate the process, and the UN is also offering to assist in the process for Qatar to mediate, to facilitate, and perhaps the UN could help Qatar in that effort. But
how much support, Ambassador, does the president of Afghanistan still retain from the United States? Because there are reports that some US officials have lost patience with Ashraf Ghani and his unwillingness to consider stepping down.
Well, as I said, the future of Afghanistan has to be decided in negotiations between the two parties, that there has to be a formula that has widespread support. The challenge is for the leaders of Afghanistan, can they do that? After the Soviet departure from Afghanistan, unfortunately, they didn't do that, and that led to a war that caused the destruction of Kabul. I expect, like the people of Afghanistan do, that they will rise this time to the occasion, not to repeat the mistake that they did before, not to put personal interests ahead of the people's interests. And until that happens, we will continue to support the Afghan government in the way that I described.
But just yes or no, I mean, will Ashraf Ghani have to go if the Taliban insist on his departure before any final agreement can be achieved between the two sides?
We do not believe in any preconditions for reaching an agreement. There has to be an agreement, and that agreement should decide the future as to what kind of government. Is there going to be a transition phase and then a permanent phase? What constitution will apply during the transition? What the permanent constitution would look like? All of these issues are relevant issues for the Afghan side to negotiate. For it to work, for any agreement has to have two features. One, it has to be broadly supported in Afghanistan. If one side imposes its will on others, it won't work. There will be resistance. And second, that the region, which plays a vital role in affecting the conflict in Afghanistan, it has to also be workable in the region. Countries like Pakistan, Iran, India, and others, China, Russia, and the international community, which will provide the financial support for the future of Afghanistan, have to feel comfortable with that agreement. And so we're also working very hard to get that regional consensus as well.
So, Ambassador, just finally, as we look ahead, what do you, as chief negotiator for the American side, say to those who believe that the U.S. miscalculated by prioritizing its hasty military withdrawal? After all, it pulled some of its troops from Bagram Air Base in the dead of night, that it prioritized this military withdrawal to meet a certain timetable over securing that long-term political settlement and preserve the socio-economic and political gains that were achieved since 2001?
I believe that the withdrawal taking place over a 20 years period of being there cannot be described as hasty, that it was a deliberate decision to withdraw, recognizing that there was no military solution, even by us staying there to the war in Afghanistan, that the time had come, since there was no military solution, for Afghans to negotiate their future, and for the U.S. to shift from a military war solution for Afghanistan to supporting a peace process and opening the door for Afghans to sit across the table. But we stand behind our principles, the principles that any peace agreement has to meet certain standards, has to be broadly supported in Afghanistan, and has to have the support of the international community. I believe that there is no better alternative to that, and we're dedicated to do all that we can to help Afghans achieve the peace that they yearn for, and to end the long war in Afghanistan that has killed, maimed, displaced millions of Afghans. The time has come to end this war. There is no justification for continuing it.
Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, great to see you again. Thank you so much for making the time.
It's great to be with you.
Meanwhile, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan says nearly 800 Afghan civilians have been killed and more than 1,600 were wounded in May and June alone. That is the highest casualty numbers over any two-month period since the UN mission began keeping records in 2009. Since 2001, at least 47,245 civilians and over 66,000 Afghan troops have been killed. 1,147 NATO troops have lost their lives between 2001 and 2021. 2,242 US troops have also been killed, and 20,666 were wounded during the same period. The war in Afghanistan has forced 2.7 million Afghans to flee the country. 4 million have been internally displaced. The war has cost the US a total of $2.26 trillion. 88 billion went to training, equipping, and funding Afghan military and police forces. Now, between 2010 and 2012, the US had more than 100,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. In 2020, there were 4,000 US troops. That number fell to 2,500 in January. The US is now expected to keep around 650 troops in Afghanistan to provide security for the US Embassy and the Kabul airport. Now, for more on the regional implications of the US pullout, I'm joined by veteran UN troubleshooter Lakhdar Brahimi, who was Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Afghanistan from 1997 to 1999 and from 2001 to 2004. He was also UN Envoy to Syria, Iraq, Haiti, South Africa, and other countries, as well as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Algeria. Ambassador Brahimi, you played a critical role after the US invasion of Afghanistan. In fact, it was at the Bonn conference that Hamid Karzai was chosen as president of Afghanistan. When you look back on those early years, US and NATO military de facto occupation, and where the country is today, what is your assessment?
Afghanistan has been in trouble for a very, very long time. People speak of the invasion by the Soviet Union in 1979. As a matter of fact, I date back the beginning of the big trouble to the toppling down of the king by his cousin, Sardar Dawood, in 1973. That was the beginning of the destabilization of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan has not been stable ever since. That is almost 50 years. That's a very, very long time for any country to be destabilized. The Taliban controlled 95% of the country in 2001. When the 9/11 happened, the Americans did not go to Afghanistan to either rebuild the country or help the country. They went to Afghanistan to punish the country because the Al-Qaeda, which attacked them, had prepared that attack in Afghanistan. We have got to remember that very well. So the Americans went there for revenge. They got their revenge, and they were stuck there. The other thing to remember is that, as a matter of fact, the people who made decisions in Washington were thinking of Iraq much more than they were thinking of Afghanistan. In September 14 or 17, a meeting took place at the Pentagon, not about Afghanistan, but about Iraq. So, they got their revenge, and they started looking to Iraq.
But what was the mistake, though, that the United States made? Were the goals too broad? Was it an open-ended mission? Was it a mistake to turn it from what it, at least publicly, was, a mission that, as you say, was focused on defeating Al-Qaeda, that then turned into an ill-defined mission? Afghanistan being the graveyard of all these empires, not just the Soviets, but the British as well. Do you believe that the US fell victim to its own hubris, thinking that it could succeed where others had failed? Where did it go wrong?
I think we all went wrong. I think the United Nations, starting in Bonn, when, as you said, Karzai was chosen, and settling down in Afghanistan as of December 2001, what we wanted to do is rebuild Afghanistan, or rather help. You see, if you look at the Bonn decision, you will never see that the United Nations do this or the other. That the United Nations will help the Afghans do this, that, and the other. We were deeply conscious of the fact that it was the Afghans who needed to rebuild their country, not foreigners. And we started reasonably well. The program established in Bonn was not too bad. For 1 year and a half, there was real peace in Afghanistan. Then, I think that after that 1 year and a half, we needed to stop, take stock of what we had done, all of us, and correct what needed to be corrected. But by that time, the Americans had invaded Iraq and were looking absent-mindedly to Afghanistan. And also, I think they were saying that Afghanistan is doing well, and the election is coming. So don't do anything to disrupt the situation in Afghanistan. That is one of the steps that we have not taken.
You've said in the past,
2003.
you've said as well that one of the gravest mistakes that everyone made, including the United States, was failing to recognize the Taliban as a force to be reckoned with early on. And that, quote,
Of course.
"You cannot fight your way to peace. Sitting down with your adversary and negotiating is the only way to resolve conflict and prevent further bloodshed." Why did it take so long then for the United States to realize that?
It's not only the United States. Everybody. We were led really by the human rights paradigm. The Taliban were the bad guys. You don't talk to them. You don't talk to them, no matter where they were and what. We didn't talk to them when they started, when they appeared on the scene in 1992 or 93. And we didn't talk to them in 2000 and 2001 when they controlled 95% of the country. This is totally wrong. And again, when they were routed, thrown out of the cities, we didn't ask a very simple question. Where did they go? Where are they? That question we were not allowed to ask because we were told the Taliban are finished, forget about them. It was a huge mistake. I now understand that they were ready to talk. Not perhaps Mullah Muhammad Omar himself, but quite a few of the Taliban were ready to listen and talk and compromise. But the Americans, the Russians, the Iranians, the Indians, all of them were one word: forget about the Taliban. Don't talk about them.
So some were saying forget about the Taliban. Others, we just heard from Ambassador Khalilzad, was saying that the conditions for talks with the Taliban before now, or before a couple of years ago, were not ripe, that the Taliban wasn't interested in negotiating with the United States. But looking at the investment that has been made in these 20 years, it took the US almost 2 decades, more than $2 trillion, not to mention tens of thousands of deaths on both sides, to arrive to that conclusion and start negotiation. Was it a mistake, though, a major mistake, to negotiate directly with the Taliban, to bypass the Afghan government, essentially leaving them in the dark? Do you think that that significantly undermined the Kabul government as it's still struggling to stand on its feet?
I mean, it's certainly, look, conditions being what they were, what they have been in these 20 years, there was no good moment for the US and NATO to leave. Any time they would have chosen to leave would have been bad. Perhaps what you need to do is, what perhaps would have been better is to signal that we are leaving and take enough time to prepare the departure of the foreigners. That they have done it in precipitation, I don't think any American will discuss that. That has happened. But my very, very dear Afghan friends, they had 20 years to also, on their side, make things right. And they too have not done so. The government and the people in Kabul, the political parties, public opinion, NGOs, they did little to prepare for the fact that the Americans are not going to be there forever to finance you have got to start preparing yourself to standing on your own 2 feet. They have done a lot, but definitely not enough, as we can see now.
And obviously some, Ambassador, obviously some regional powers and others are now preparing to fill that vacuum that the US is leaving. China, just this week, welcomed a Taliban delegation to Beijing, openly backed the role of the Taliban in Afghanistan's future. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, in fact, said that the the US's hasty withdrawal was a mark of its policy failures in Afghanistan and that China will not interfere in the country's internal affairs. But do you take Beijing at its word, or do you think that China will fill the US vacuum, perhaps not militarily, but that it will play a dominant, significant role in Afghanistan's future?
The Chinese are, their philosophy really is to interfere as little as possible in internal matters of other countries. They will build relationships, and that is what I'm sure they will try to do. But the Chinese are not the only important country there. The important countries are Pakistan, Iran, India. These three countries will most probably be the countries that are going to decide whether Afghanistan is going to have peace at last or whether wars are going to continue in Afghanistan.
And of course, it remains to be seen if the United States would retain any kind of serious leverage once it leaves, because there's every indication that this war isn't over. The US says it may continue to strike Taliban targets after its troop withdrawal. But looking at the countries that you've mentioned and keeping aside the fact that obviously China is trying to wound the wound of the Americans leaving with some salt, and that it may succeed with its soft power where others have failed. What do you think will be the key player to look at? Would it be Pakistan? Would it be Iran? Would it be India? Who do you think will call the shots from this point on?
Calling the shot is difficult to say. That is what the mistakes have been made. Only the Afghans call the shots at the end of it. But these three countries are terribly important because they will be watching one another. So they have at the same time to decide that there will be peace. If one of them decides that no, war is more profitable to them, then the other two will follow suit and will also pursue war.
Is it in Pakistan's interest? And Pakistan has played a hugely significant role, obviously, throughout Afghanistan's modern history. But many believe that it has the back of the Taliban, while India is supporting the government in which it has been heavily invested. With this additional willingness of China to play a larger role, how will the Pakistan-India rivalry affect Afghanistan? Because it's not often talked about, but it's been an important factor, hasn't it?
China is becoming a world player, not only in Afghanistan, but everywhere else in the world. It is, whether anybody likes it or dislikes it, a major power in the world. They have problems with India. That is also very important to remember. And they play their cards in general very carefully. They are close to Pakistan. I have every reason to believe that peace in Afghanistan is in their interest. And I have every reason to believe that now that the Americans are gone, they have no reason to want war in Afghanistan. People were saying that China, Iran, and so on wanted the US out. No, they didn't want the US out. They wanted the US to continue to bleed in Afghanistan. Now that the US is gone, they can't bleed it in Afghanistan. I'm sure that China in particular will want peace.
Looking back though, Ambassador Brahimi, when you resigned as UN envoy to Afghanistan back in October of 1999, you told the Security Council that basically there was no point in any mediation unless and until Pakistan and its intelligence services, the ISI, were on board. Do you really believe that Pakistan today is on board to stabilize Afghanistan? Is it ultimately in its interest to see the Taliban back in Kabul when it has to contend with its own Taliban?
Yeah, in October I said something else. I also told them, you are not interested in Afghanistan because it's a poor country, it's a faraway country, and if Afghans want to kill themselves, who cares? But you are wrong. One day it will explode in our faces, all of us. And it did 2 years later. ISI was, had major influence because they had been there and active all the time. And they also, they had the merit of seeing the potential of the Taliban before everybody else. What is their position today? I hope that they have understood that war will not serve them anymore.
Let me ask you this, though. If the Taliban take over Kabul, and they've made huge inroads militarily in recent weeks, if they take over Kabul in the absence of a final power-sharing agreement with the government there, will they be recognized internationally? Because the last time around, I believe that only Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Pakistan gave them diplomatic recognition. Have things changed?
Yeah, sure. Things have changed, as you said yourself. They are now received not only they've negotiated directly with America and signed degree. And by the way, the Americans accept for them to sign as the Afghan, the Emirate, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, not as the Taliban. Not only that, but they are received in Washington, in Peking, in Moscow, in Tehran, several times. And I'm not sure about India, whether India has received a visit by them or not. But if they haven't, they will. So I think they will be recognized, definitely.
And how much have they changed as a group? Because I know you negotiated with Mullah Omar and the Taliban leadership back in the 1990s. Are the Taliban of 2021 the same as the Taliban of 20 years ago? Because some people speak of the neo-Taliban.
I have no idea. I haven't talked to them. It was fascinating in my discussions with 3 times with Mullah Muhammad Omar. How much they have changed. They themselves are saying we have changed. You can see signs that they have changed. They don't say anymore no schools for girls. On this score, at least they have made some. There is some change. How much change? They also are saying we want to share power. So what we desperately need is for the negotiations in Doha to succeed. Some agreement. That agreement will be extremely difficult to implement. But there will be a huge difference between whether we have an agreement in Doha, difficult to implement, or whether the Taliban will enter Kabul. I think they are aware that it's a difficult thing to do or accept.
Let me shift, Ambassador Brahimi, if I can, to the wider region. The U.S. is now also pulling out of Iraq. You were UN envoy for Iraq after the 2003 U.S.-led invasion. Was it a mistake, in your opinion, to transform what started out as that limited mission to fight al-Qaeda into this open-ended military occupation, to have launched another war in Iraq 2 years later? And now that the U.S. is pulling out of both countries, will we see a new realignment in the region? How do you think these U.S. troop pullouts will affect the regional dynamics?
Our region is very, very badly destabilized and disorganized. We are not masters of our situation anymore. None of us. The invasion of Iraq has been a huge destabilizing factor in the region. And Iran used to say we are an important country, and you have to treat us and respect us as an important country. Now they don't say that anymore. They say, no, we are not an important country. We are the most important country in the region. But for God's sake, they control the oil of Iraq and Iran. That is much more than Saudi Arabia has. They have overwhelming influence in Iraq, overwhelming influence in Lebanon, and overwhelming influence in Syria. So you cannot ignore this reality. And the problems of the regions are so mixed up with one another that we need really to think of the region as a whole. And really, our leaders should be saying, the Americans will leave one day. Even the Russians will leave Syria one day. What are we going to do? How are we going to leave? So we have got to take our affairs in our hands and responsibly find a way of working and of living and working together. That responsibility doesn't seem to be there for the moment.
Ambassador Lakhdar, Brahimi, real pleasure to see you again. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and for sharing your invaluable insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
"20 years and $2 trillion later, the US is leaving Afghanistan in tatters. And in the end, Washington negotiated a bilateral agreement with the Taliban as if there were no Afghan government in place. Afghanistan has become America's new Vietnam. Both wars lasted 20 years and ended the same way. Between 1969 and 73, Henry Kissinger, then US National Security Advisor, and Le Duc Tho, the representative of Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnam, negotiated, secretly at first, unbeknownst to the South Vietnam government, in a modest house outside Paris. Both would be awarded in 1973 the Nobel Peace Prize for the Paris Peace Accords on Vietnam. But Le Duc Tho rejected the prize because the US had violated a truce when it started its massive, covert bombing of Cambodia and Laos, seeking to destroy the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail and bases. Now, the US tried also to destroy the Taliban from the air at first, only to have bilateral secret talks and then discreet negotiations with the Taliban in Doha. Just like North Vietnam reunified the country and took over Saigon, so it seems the Taliban have Kabul in their line of sight. This time around, though, there are no Nobel Peace Prizes in sight. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team here in Washington. Thanks for watching. See you next time.